Well, good evening. I'm Peter Schneck, and I'm happy to welcome Winfried Fluck for a short, brief interview following up on your talk, which was accidentally also the final talk of the conference. And because we have only little time to respond to a very rich presentation, I just wanted to start out right away in pointing out or commenting on what I see is a certain programmatic aspect of your talk, because you addressed a central question of, or a central problem at the project, as you called it, the project of reanimating or returning to the aesthetic in American studies. And so you told a narrative of a convergence or even some sort of complicity between two developments. One was the development in aesthetic theory and artistic practice, and on the other in critical literary studies. And you ended with saying that even though these practices are certainly different, they converge on the fact that they have gradually developed towards a certain concept of freedom from constraint, which was supposed to compensate or even supplant a former understanding of freedom from instrumentalization, which you connected to formalism and earlier approaches in American studies. I wanted to ask, because he ended on what seemed to me an appeal to, first of all, put more effort into reflecting about the normative foundations of our critical practices, but also the practices of art in America. But even more than just an appeal to analytically reflect on this, you called, I think, for a kind of normative reorientation, to move away from what you call the freedom of constraint. And I wanted to ask, it seems to me that the aesthetic, as you described it, meant several things at once. Well, it's obvious, we talked about this a lot. First of all, it is obviously an analytical and critical category. This is something that we need to approach artistic productions. But on the other hand, it also directly informs those practices. And you carved out that the aesthetic, as it is understood in the critical approaches to artistic practices, and the artistic practices themselves converge on this freedom from constraint notion. But it's also a criteria of value. My question is, if we attempt a reorientation on the normative basis, how does that affect our methods of approaching artistic practices? So to have an understanding of freedom, which informs our analysis of artworks, can either be deduced from these artworks, or it can be presupposed. And if it is presupposed, but nevertheless not there in the artistic artworks, it seems to me that is a methodological problem.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to consider what the origin of the whole argument is, and that's the claim of the conference that the aesthetic is in trouble and that we should do something about it, reanimate it. The usual explanation why it is in trouble is often the politicization, that somehow it has been appropriated by the new social movements, or sometimes in art practice, contemporary art practice, that the artists don't have any sort of limits anymore. They're striving for a boundaryless freedom. And my point, that was the first point that is important, I think, is that these are not the actual reasons. The actual reasons lie deeper. They lie in the fact that that art traditionally within certain philosophies has played the role of being a space that is disinterested or outside of dominance or utopian. And I've sort of summarized this by using the word freedom. And this is a development that is, I wouldn't say complicit or anything, and there's parallel. It's a general sort of development that is driven by a transition from liberalism, basically in politics, to radicalism in the American humanities. So, and you're right in pointing this out, there is a normative implication. The normative implication is that if we ever want to get back to a term like the aesthetic, and that's the argument generally is necessary in order to justify the field in which we are, otherwise we wouldn't have a good reason. We could also do sociology or political science. But if you want to get back to a concept that could anchor our field again, then you have to reconsider whether you really want to stay with this radical notion of freedom that has been introduced by the Blue Social Movement, basically. So that doesn't say yet what the alternative could be. There are various other possibilities of defining freedom, and in each case, I think the problem of practice that you referred to, that you don't know what is first, either the concept or the art object, is a process of negotiation. I mean, Wolfgang Ise has once described the development of avant-garde art beautifully by saying, well, you have art that is somehow resonant, but people do not quite understand it yet, so they have to try to explain it. This is the moment in which criticism begins going. The criticism has a feedback on the next production of art. The next production of art has a feedback on the criticism of art. So, I mean, these two sides are moving along, and you do not know yet what the result will be. That's a give and take, basically, I would say. That's why this is not my concern, because I think this will be an inevitable result once you start the search for a new kind of, new understanding of freedom anew.
Okay. So if there's a mutual impact, and I can see that, between the act of criticism and artistic practices, one would want to ask, what do we do with addressing the question of form? You may, in the very end of your talk, you turn to the necessity to have a definition of beauty, and I took beauty as a stand-in for value per se. How would we go about that when talking about forms? And, I mean, it almost sounded as if form has become irrelevant.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, the argument about beauty is that whenever you introduce any value, evaluation in criticism of an aesthetic kind, you call something beautiful or sublime or picturesque, you have to have a philosophical reason why that's supposed to be a good thing. You know, just saying something is beautiful is not enough yet in criticism. And so you have to have some context, some explanatory context in which this concept makes sense. And that's what we're talking about right now. Under what context can certain developments in art, in criticism, make sense again? And I claim, under the concept that is now dominant, they cannot. And so we have to begin to look for alternatives.
So let me have one last question. So would that mean a return to the judgment of works of art according to their formal merits? Form
is something that is an important part of this whole discussion, because the challenge of these debates about aesthetic is that you have to be able to define the aesthetic as a separate sphere. And how do you do that? One possibility is form, so the only one, but that's something that is identifiable as an object that is not identical with the life world. And by what means it differs and so on is another interesting question of the discussion. But I mean, form is one possibility of getting out of this problem, and it's in fact one of the ways that you can observe now in current debates. There's something like a new formalism in the current debates about the status of literary criticism, and Walter Ben Michaels, in his book The Beauty of a Social Problem, goes that way. There will be a new book coming out by Nick Brown. It's called Autonomy. Mm-hmm. Okay. So even the concept of autonomy returns. You know? These are options. This is not, you don't have the one king's way, but people are trying out various things too. So how can we get back to a separate sphere?
Yeah. One of the arguments against the autonomy of the aesthetic was that if aesthetic practice are autonomous in criticism, then we are talking about something that is not political. So if we return to the discussion of forms, does it mean that we're becoming less political?
Well, that will be the challenge. I don't think we can get less political. That we have reached a phase where the political is such an obvious element of all critical activities that you can't go back. But you have to find ways in order to sort of combine the aesthetic and the political dimension, no longer in the way of reflection, no longer in the way of sort of some kind of mimicry or replication. The argument has to be more complex, but to sort of reanimate the concept of the aesthetic does not mean that you give up the political. That, I think, is you can't do that anymore nowadays, and so the challenge. Our field is always sort of in theoretical development. What are the new challenges? What are the new questions? For me, at the moment, the challenge would be, okay, how can you regain some element, some dimension that you can identify as separate and sort of also evaluate? You can say, this is good or this is bad. This is a good version, this is the bad version of the same. Identify such a thing and then also make the connection to its political consequences, its political function, and so on, which, however, most likely and most successfully it will have as an autonomous object. It can do its work best if it does it on its own terms.
On that note,
yeah.
Thank you.